Now, I can remember years ago when I first started taking pictures, and I started taking pictures back when I was in high school, and I took photography classes in high school, and one of the arms of my photography class was vocational photography. I was at a school that actually had a vocational photography class, and we were basically learning how to do portraits and journalism. And basically that was it. I mean, we learned the basics of photography like composition, and back then it was developing film. We didn't have digital photography. And so it was very kind of basic, but the vocation was oriented towards taking portraits of people and doing weddings and doing grin and grips, when there was any kind of a ceremony and you got to shake someone's hand, the photographer's there to do that. And journalism and sports photography and those types of things. So that was high school. And when I went to college, I went to Trade Tech College, which was a trade school that had photography. And it was a commercial photography class. All the students had to own a view camera because we learned to do commercial photography, where we shot still life pictures of products, and where we shot portraits, and where we learned how to do, again, grin and grips and weddings and all kind of various things, because we were learning photography as a trade, not as a fine art. Now, of course, we wanted to make our pictures look good, so we needed to learn something about composition, and composition is no more than the visual organization of things inside of the frame of the camera. But it was commercially oriented. And from there, I matriculated to a university. And at the university, photography was in the industrial arts department. So it's in the industrial arts department, it didn't have a lot to do with art. And, I actually had a couple of teachers who were kind of frustrated because it was in the industrial arts department instead of in the arts department. So, when I was younger, which was a few years ago, you can tell by the gray hair and so forth that, it was probably 50 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, photography was not known as fine art. And there were a handful of photographers who were actually approaching it as a fine art and who could actually make a living at it. And I'm talking about a handful, and the names, Ansel Adams and Brett Weston, and basically it was just a handful. And if they were making a living, they weren't making a good living as artists. The fact that some of them became artists that could make a very good living was very late in their careers. Photographers 30 or 40 years ago who came into photography and they called it art, they came in through the back door. They were doing commercial art, and their work evolved into things that were more artistic until it got to the point where they could actually call it fine art, and it was. I like to use an example. When I first got out of high school, I had a job working for this photo studio, and it wasn't really a studio, it was a processing plant. And the owner of the place had hired itinerant photographers who traveled all over the country, and they would book portrait sessions, and they would set up their little studio in department stores and grocery stores, and it was basically baby pictures, and sometimes it would be family pictures. And the pictures were they weren't very good at all, and the itinerant photographers would mail their film back to us, and they used to ship it on Greyhound buses. And I'd go downtown and I'd pick up the film and I'd bring it back to the place, and we processed the film, and I was the one who made proofs. And I would make hundreds and hundreds of proofs a day. And I'm looking at these negatives that come through, and I've got a little roller thing where I roll the negative, and a little paper carriage where the paper is, 100-foot roll of paper, and it was an automated system where the paper would advance. And I'd expose it, and it would advance again, and I'd go to the next negative. And I was looking at these little beady-eyed babies all day. And I didn't have any respect for people who did baby photographs because it just looked like junk, And I asked the boss, I said, Jerry, how can we sell this stuff? And he says, hey, people love their babies, and that's what counts. Doesn't have to be good photography because they love their children, And it's like, yeah, I kind of understood it, but the pictures still, they look kind of bad. I shouldn't say kind of bad. They were bad, okay? But I began to gain respect for people who were doing things with children that I never would have thought of. And one of them was Annie Geddes. She made these fantastic pictures of babies because she didn't just plop them down in front of a painted background and hold up some kind of little toy and say, yeah, and then click the shutter. She worked hard at making the pictures distinctive, and she would build props. She would create contradictions, visual contradictions, so that she put the babies in places that you wouldn't expect to see them. And she came up with these amazing pictures. Now, I bought a couple of Ann Geddes books because, I was so amazed. Now, I'll show you books, but I won't show you a lot of the pictures because, they're copyright things, so I can't, put them in a program. But if you want to see some amazing baby photographs, I'm going to see if I can find a couple real quickly here. Look at the work of Ann Geddes. It's just amazing. It's amazing. It's beautiful. And, I collect photo books. But I don't just collect any photo book. It has to be something that is really exciting or interesting. And so when I look at these pictures, it's kind of like, yeah, that's not just the average baby picture. See, I can hold up the book, so I'm not going to get sued for holding up her book because, maybe you'll go buy one, or something like that. But, if you want to check out something that is a very common subject that someone has done something unique with, look at the work of Ann Geddes, okay? When we think of photojournalists, we think of newspaper photographers. They go out and they go on assignment and they shoot something. Well, it's evolved to much more than that, When people shoot newspaper photographs, they're going for that shot. Well, when it evolves into art, it becomes storytelling. So there are a series of pictures. And one of the first people who were taking pictures of everyday life, and of course they were all struggling. And, photographers like Andre Cortez and Cartier-Bresson, okay? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not French. But we began to have photographers who worked for major magazines because that was a venue for photographers. They could work for magazines and make a living. And one of the photographers at the forefront of that was Eugene Smith. Well, instead of Eugene Smith going out and taking one or two photographs that represented whatever the assignment was, he would do what was called a photo essay, where he would take a series of pictures that told a story. I would suggest that you start doing research. I don't mean research where you have to go and write down a whole bunch of stuff and make footnotes and all that kind of stuff, but just looking at pictures by some of these photographers who determined the direction photography was taking. Eugene Smith made pictures that did stories that took sometimes weeks or months to finish, and his editors were always angry with him because he's disappeared and he's working on the story for such a long time. But These stories became so iconic, and he called them photo essays. And this was one on the Spanish Revolution. And I would encourage you to go to Instagram and look up these photographers. Look up Eugene Smith and look at the fantastic work that he did on these photo essays. There's a photographer now, and most of these people that I've talked about, except for Ann Geddes, they're long gone. But there's one that is with us, and he's doing the most amazing work. And I would suggest that you look for the work by Sebastião Salgado, okay? And he does these, not an essay, but a whole story. Sometimes he will work on a story for years. One of the first one was called Work, where he did a series of pictures about people who were laboring. It's a beautiful book. This one, I think, is his largest one so far, and it's called Amazonia. It's about the Amazon basin and the people who live there and the landscape and what's happening to it and so forth and so on. And the photographs are beautiful. When he first started working, he was working with film, but he switched over to digital now. So, so the work, I think, has evolved past just telling a story to telling it in a way that's very artistic. And we could actually call art, because I think the difference between making pretty pictures and art is usually done with intention, okay? Pretty pictures, we take them because it's beautiful, it's aesthetically pleasing, but it's usually not great art. It's great art when we have intention. When you're driving along and you say, oh, that's just beautiful, and you whip out your camera and you take a picture and you show all your friends, it's not art, it's just a pretty picture. But there's nothing wrong with making pretty pictures. However, when we start calling it art, I don't know about that. Now, when we look at landscape photographs by people that were like Ansel Adams or Edward Weston, those were done with intention. And we're going to look at some photographs that are done with intention later on. Okay, but there's a whole history of people who were making photographs that told stories. And some of them were done during the Great Depression, when photographers were actually hired to tell stories about what was happening in America. And I can pull some of those pictures up, and we're going to look at some of them because we have access to them because they were paid for by the government, and you all have access to them. You can look them up on government websites, and you can actually get copies of them because they have the negatives, and it's owned by the government, and so they give them away. So we're going to look at some of those things. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to move on. And I'm going to stop jaw-jacking for a little while until we can look at some of these pictures that were taken by by government photographers during the Great Depression. I'm going to talk to you about two photographers that were taking pictures during the Great Depression. One of them is Dorothea Lange, and the other is Gordon Parks. Dorothea Lange, first she was a woman. There were not very many women photographers, but she was working to photograph the displaced farmers during the Great Depression. A lot of farmers lost their farms, and because of the Dust Bowl and the Depression, it was like a double whammy. And they became migrants because they were looking for some way, some means of work to support themselves. And many of them migrated to the West, and they came out to California looking for work. And Dorothea Lange worked to try and document the struggles of these farmers and their families. There was one small family that she took pictures of, and she became very famous for that, for one of those photographs. But when she was working on a group of pictures that documented a whole movement. And sometimes when a photographer is working in that mode, there will be one or two pictures that stand out, and this one of this migrant mother and her children is the one that kind of defined who she was as a photographer. And so this was not just a single photograph that she took in it, but she wanted the pictures to be very raw and descriptive, so they were not posed or set up or lit or anything else. They were just the way the people were in the conditions they were existing in. And oftentimes, when a photographer is trying to truly document something, they will not manipulate things if they want it to be true to what it really is. And Dorothea Lange was doing that. Now, Gordon Parks was in Washington, D.C., and he had just started working. He was hired by the FSA also, Farm Security Administration. And he noticed this black woman who was cleaning the offices, and he started talking to her and talking about the struggles that she was undergoing and what her life was like, because he didn't want to just make photographs and move on. He wanted to make photographs that really expressed the condition that some people were dealing with. Now, at the time, Washington, D.C. was segregated, and so this woman was relegated, because she was a black woman, to only doing custodial or menial tasks. And so he visited her family, and he got to know her, and he shot a series of pictures of Ella Watson. That was her name, Ella Watson. And he decided to make a picture that was really illustrative of how he felt about the condition of black people in Washington, D.C. at that time in history. So he positioned her in front of the American flag with a mop in one hand and a broom in the other. Now, this was a posed picture, but he did it purposely to try and convey a message or information about the indignities that were put upon black people regardless of their abilities at that point in time in that place. And he named this American Gothic. And it kind of defined Gordon Parks as one of his most famous photographs. Now, I mean, he was long-lived, and he was really almost like a Renaissance man, because he wrote symphonies and poetry and books, and he was quite accomplished. But this photograph kind of defined who he was. So this was also a picture from a series, and it was the one that stood out the most. So this kind of frames where photographers begin to, or how photographers begin to develop working to make series of pictures that told stories. And they were working in different ways. Gordon Parks, this one was posed and was set up. And Dorothea Lange, hers was very raw and was the way it was. But both of them were effective in their own way. So, we're going to come to another session, my next session, and I'm going to talk about a little bit more about photographers, and I'm going to include myself because I can show my work, without worrying about being sued, and I can talk about how I work and how some other photographers work, and I'll share the names of some other photographers that are working to make groups of pictures that help tell a story or give information. So there we are.